When someone is learning to read, there's a great emphasis placed on the sounding out of letters, and specifically phonetics as the foundation for reading skills. This was true in Shakespeare's lifetime as well, which posed a real difficulty for anyone who was deaf. In order to find out exactly how a deaf person would have been educated, and specifically how they were taught to read in the 16th and 17th century, we sat down with Mary Lutze, assistant professor of English and director of the Writing Center at the University of Arkansas, Fort Smith. She presented and published essays on disability studies, deaf theater, and the development of deaf theater history. Here's what she had to say. You referred to this earlier with Pedro Ponce de Leon and the problem he identified educating the deaf. But one reason members of deaf culture were not being taught to read is that when you teach someone to read, there's a great emphasis placed on the sounding out of letters and specifically phonetics as the foundation for reading skills. For a deaf person who can't hear those sounds, how were they taught to read in the 16th and 17th century?
Great question. And interestingly enough, many of the pedagogues or instructors of the 17th century were more determined to teach deaf pupils to speak than they were to teach them to write or read. So teaching the deaf to write was considered a useful skill, but it was also considered kind of a stepping stone towards utterance. In that time, many legal proceedings, such as the passage of inheritance, which again in Spain was a huge deal and also was in England, um, the passage of that inheritance was dependent upon vocalization in many cases. So pedagogues and linguists in the 17th century were more open to utilizing dactylology or finger spelling and natural signing as a resource in the acquisition of written and spoken standard English. However, it was clear that the goal was eventually to do away with signing in favor of English. It really was their purpose was to acquire English. So most use recognition as a common ground. So they would find a physical object and they would teach the student the word for that object, spelling it out by writing after they had taught the alphabet, until the student recognized the written word and associate it with the physical object. Now, to your question of how would they actually teach them to do this when they couldn't hear, for William Holder, one of the educators of that deaf young man I mentioned before, Alexander Popham, he would teach the alphabet via writing as the imperative first step, and that would help the pupil to learn to write and read as others can. But also, he would do this because the acquisition of speech by sight depended upon an understanding of articulation. So, to accomplish teaching the deaf to speak by sight, Holder's instruction began with teaching again that alphabet until Popham could write his letters. Holder's directions then for teaching speech always began with the instruction to write the word. So he would test the knowledge of Popham before then he offered the supplemental tool to make signs, but not necessarily naturally signing, but gestures such as pointing at the desired word that he wanted Popham to pronounce, and then to personally demonstrate on his own lips how to pronounce various phonemes. So taking a letter at a time, the instructor, or Holder in this case, would have the student write the letter before having him observe the pronunciation of it on the lips of the instructor. The student would then be encouraged to attempt that utterance. Once the student correctly pronounced the letter, the instructor was to show him, and this is a quote, show him upon the paper the letter he pronounced to reinforce his understanding of the letter and its pronunciation, and then reward the student with, quote, much applauding and encouraging before having the student repeat it often until, quote, again, he be very perfect, both in the pronunciation and in the written character of the letter. So through painstaking description and most likely some aspect of show and tell through gesture, instructors tutored deaf students on recognizing where to place tongues, the teeth, the lips in pronouncing specific phonemes or syllables. And they usually would have some kind of wooden and cloth model of the mouth and tongue to show placement before then doing it with their own. And they might have even had the student place it, they might say pronounce T, and have the student place the tongue where he thinks it should be, whether that's lateral placement, near the teeth, near the throat, or vertical or horizontal placement at the roof of the mouth or at the floor of the mouth. Then the instructor would teach pupils how to shape, move, or even close their lips in the vocalization of different consonants and vowels. And in this way, deaf students in that century were taught as much as possible how to strike the proper tone while making utterances. And understandably, mimicking speech depended entirely on the individual instructor's subjective interpretation of proper pronunciation, as well as in their own skill in imparting concepts of sound to those who had no concept of sound. It also depended on the student's own self-perception, teachability, and recognition of the constriction or relaxation of muscles in the throat as a means of controlling pitch, or the placement of sound in the throat rather than the adenoidal passages to avoid nasal resonance.
To hear more about deaf culture in Shakespeare's lifetime, including the history of British Sign Language and the manuals that were published to help teach sign language in the 16th and 17th century, explore our entire podcast with Mary Lutze at CassidyCash.com/EP317. While you're there, click the Patreon button to support our show, and bonus content, including excerpts from some of the sign language manuals, as well as more information on the people who developed sign language for Shakespeare's lifetime, will expand right there on the website. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.